There are some stories that come to us quietly, almost by accident, the way a letter finds you decades after it was written. This is one of them. We think, once you've heard it, you'll understand why we couldn't keep it to ourselves. Margaret Elaine Proctor was 22 years old, and by the blunt arithmetic of the world, she had nothing. Not nothing in the way people sometimes say it when they mean they're tired or embarrassed or between paychecks. Nothing in the true and weightless sense, no address, no savings, no family she could call on. The house she'd grown up in, a narrow clapboard place outside of Haliburton, Ontario, with a porch that tilted slightly toward the east, had belonged to her uncle by law since her mother's passing 4 years prior. And when Margaret turned 22 in the cold first week of November, her uncle, a man named Gerald Ashworth, a property agent who wore his authority the way other men wore cologne, decided she had worn out her welcome. He didn't raise his voice. That was the part she told people later, the part that stayed with her longer than she expected. He simply set a box of her things outside the back door one morning while she was still in her boots and said the house needed to be used for other purposes now. He used the phrase other purposes, as though she were a storage problem that had finally been resolved. She took the box. She walked to the road. She didn't look back, because she had her mother's stubbornness in her. And her mother had always said that looking back was a luxury you couldn't afford when you didn't know yet what was in front of you. What was in front of her, on that particular Tuesday, was a small town, a bus station, and $63 in her coat pocket, and the chisel. She'd wrapped it in an old cloth and tucked it at the bottom of the box beneath a sweater and the photograph of her mother and a paperback she'd never finished. It had belonged to Arthur Kemp, the man who'd taught her woodworking in the barn behind his property from the time she was 14 until he passed 3 winters ago. A short, unhurried man with sawdust permanently in his eyebrows. Arthur had spent 8 years showing Margaret how to read the grain of wood the way some people read faces, with patience and a willingness to be surprised. When he died, he left her his tools. Most she'd sold or lost in the years since. But the chisel, an old Witherby with a maple handle worn smooth in exactly the right places, she kept. It felt less like a tool and more like a handshake from someone who had believed in her. She carried it to the bus station. She didn't know where she was going when she bought the ticket. She asked for somewhere north of $60, and the woman behind the counter suggested Minden or Bancroft, or, if she was feeling adventurous, a smaller stop called Galton's Landing, a mill town that had been trying to become something else since the mill closed. Margaret said Galton's Landing without quite knowing why. Perhaps because it sounded like somewhere that had also recently lost its purpose and was still working out what came next. The bus ride was 2.5 hours. The seat smelled of old coffee and upholstery cleaner, and the window was fogged at the edges, and the trees outside were the bare gray skeletons of trees that had already decided winter was coming, and there was no point in arguing about it. Margaret sat with the box on her knees and the chisel somewhere at the bottom of it, and she thought about Arthur Kemp. She thought about the last lesson he'd given her, which was not about woodworking at all. He'd been sick by then, and they'd sat on the porch in the late August heat, and he'd said, "The work is never really about the thing you're making. The work is about learning to trust your own hands." She hadn't understood it then. She was beginning to, now. Galton's Landing was smaller than she'd imagined and quieter than she'd hoped. A main street with a hardware store, a diner, a credit union, a church hall, and 3 or 4 other buildings that seemed uncertain of their function. There was a motel at the edge of town where a room cost $40 a night, which meant she could afford 1 night and a bus ticket out, or 2 nights and nothing else. She chose 2 nights. The woman at the diner, Ruth Ann, her name tag said, a woman in her 60s with the kind of handshake that meant she'd been working since before Margaret was born, gave her coffee without being asked and told her about the town without being prompted. It was the kind of hospitality that Margaret associated with places that had learned not to take visitors for granted. Ruth Ann mentioned, as an aside, that there was an estate sale the following morning. Lionel Beaumont, the old postmaster, had passed in September, and his niece was clearing the property. The niece had come from somewhere else, Ruth Ann said, with the tone of someone describing a minor tragedy, and she was selling everything. There'd be furniture, boxes, tools. The barn behind the property had things in it that hadn't been touched in years, maybe longer. Margaret thanked her for the coffee and walked to the motel and slept better than she'd expected. She was at the Beaumont property by 8 the next morning. It was a farmstead at the end of a gravel road, modest and well kept in the way that things are well kept when someone has spent a lifetime caring about them and then suddenly the caring stops. Denise, a practical-looking woman named Denise, was already directing a small stream of people through the barn and the outbuildings. Cardboard signs on stakes, furniture, tools, miscellaneous, make offer. Margaret went through the barn slowly. She didn't have money to spend, not really. But she was a woodworker. She couldn't walk past a barn full of hand tools without looking. She examined a set of chisels and thought of Arthur's. She looked at a hand plane and ran her thumb along the sole the way he'd taught her. She was doing this, standing in the far corner of the barn, when she noticed the door. It was in the back wall, a door that led to a secondary structure, a lean-to that abutted the barn. Newer construction than the barn itself, though still old. The door was padlocked. Not just locked. The hasp was rusted through, and the padlock itself was so old and seized that the keyhole was barely visible. Someone had tried to open it at some point. The wood around the hasp was scarred, but they hadn't succeeded. She asked Denise about it. Denise shrugged the way people shrug when something has existed long enough to become invisible. "We don't have a key. Uncle Lionel never mentioned it. Been that way since before I remember visiting." She paused. "Since at least the 90s, I'd guess. Maybe earlier. What's in there?" "No idea." Another shrug. "Nothing we could use." "Probably, or he'd have opened it." She looked at the door with the particular expression of someone who has many things to do before noon. "I'll take $4 for the rights to whatever's inside. If you want to deal with it, it's yours." Margaret looked at the door. She thought about her $63. She thought about the chisel at the bottom of her box. She paid $4. There are moments, we think, that look small from the outside. $4. A padlocked door. A young woman with a box of belongings and no particular plan. You wouldn't have looked twice. But that's the thing about moments like this. They don't announce themselves. They just sit there, waiting. Margaret came back to the lean-to after the sail had thinned out. She had her chisel. She had time. She worked at the hasp methodically, the way Arthur had taught her to approach any stubborn joint, not with force, but with attention. Find where the tension is. Work around it. Don't fight the material. Understand it. It took nearly an hour. The hasp finally gave with a sound like a held breath being released. The door swung open. The lean-to smelled of cold and cedar and something older than both. It was dim, the only light coming through two small windows layered in dust, but it was enough. She stood in the doorway and looked, and for a moment she didn't move. The space was full. Not cluttered. Organized. That was what stopped her. Whatever was in here, it had been arranged deliberately and with care. Along one wall, a workbench, and on the workbench, tools, woodworking tools, hand tools, beautiful ones, the kind of thing you didn't see anymore because the people who used them had mostly gone. Carving gouges in their original roles. Marking gauges, bevels, a rosewood-handled saw, and beside them, stacked on shelves that someone had built into the opposite wall, wooden pieces, small ones. Finished work. Boxes, frames, a rocking cradle barely big enough for a doll, a writing slope with inlaid trim, every one of them exquisite. Every one of them, as far as Margaret could tell, untouched. She picked up the nearest piece, a small letterbox with dovetail corners, so fine they barely seemed possible, and turned it over in her hands. On the base, in a careful hand, L. Beaumont, 1987. Lionel had made these. She set the letterbox down and went to the workbench and looked more carefully, and then she found, behind the tool rolls, a tin. The kind that once held hard candies, the lid fitted tight with years of pressure. She worked it open. Inside, papers. Not loose, folded carefully, many of them, some in envelopes, and beneath them, a small notebook, cloth-covered, the kind you'd find at a stationer's a long time ago. She opened the notebook. The handwriting was cramped and deliberate, the handwriting of someone who had learned to write in an era when you wrote as though the words cost something. The first page, for whoever finds this, I don't know who you are. But if you're reading this, you know about the work, and that's enough. We want you to sit with that for a moment. You know about the work, and that's enough. A man who had been gone for 3 months, writing to a stranger decades before she arrived. A young woman standing in a lean-to with sawdust on her boots and $4 spent, and everything she owned in a cardboard box. Sometimes the world sets things up with a patience that none of us could manage on our own. Margaret sat down on an overturned crate, and she read. Lionel Beaumont had been the postmaster of Galton's Landing for 31 years. What the town didn't know, what he'd never told anyone, was that he'd also been its keeper in a way that had nothing to do with mail. For decades, he had been quietly documenting what was happening to it. The notebook was meticulous. Names of families who'd left when the mill closed. Names of families who'd stayed and struggled. Records of informal loans. Money Lionel had given out of his own pocket, modest sums, $5 here, 20 there, to people who needed a month's grace on their heating or a bag of flour when the weeks ran long. He'd kept track not because he expected repayment, but because he'd been afraid that if he didn't, someone might look at this town in 40 years and think nothing had happened here. He wanted a record. He wanted someone to know that people had tried. And then there were the letters, folded in the envelopes, dozens of them, spanning 30 years. Letters from families who'd moved away. Letters from children of families, grown now, writing back to the town because Lionel had kept writing to them. Postcards at Christmas, a line at Easter, the occasional note that said only, "We still remember you here." Some of the letters were long, some were short. One, from a woman named Patricia Allett, who had moved to Calgary in 1994 when she was 19, said, "I don't know if you know what it meant, that someone bothered. My mother kept every card you sent. She said it was the only proof she had that Galton's Landing was real." Margaret read for a long time, and then she found the last section of the notebook. It was titled simply, "The Work." Lionel Beaumont, in the final years of his life, had developed what he called a lending library of things. Not books, objects, tools, mostly also a sewing machine, a bread tin, a set of canning jars, things he'd made or repaired or acquired, and lent out quietly to people who needed them and would return them when they were finished. He'd trained 3 young people in basic woodworking sessions in this lean-to on Saturday mornings, because he'd worried that when he was gone, nobody in the valley would know how to fix their own furniture. He'd repaired the pew benches in the church hall twice, without telling anyone who'd done it. He'd left bags of split firewood on the porches of 4 households every November for the last 11 years, always before dawn, never acknowledged. At the bottom of the last page, in handwriting that was slightly less steady than the rest, as though it had been written more recently, "The tools are for whoever needs them. The work continues if someone wants it to. The only condition I'd ask is that they teach someone else." Margaret sat in the lean-to for a long time after she finished reading. Outside, the November light was thinning, the way it does in Ontario in that particular season, pulling back from the land like it has somewhere else to be. The finished pieces on the shelves caught what light remained. That letter box with the dovetails, the rocking cradle, a jewelry box she hadn't noticed before, maple with cherry inlay, the lid fitted so precisely it sealed without a sound. She thought about Arthur Kemp. She thought about his chisel in her hand, the weight of it, the way it had found the resistance in the rusted hasp and worked around it. She thought about the last thing he'd said to her. "The work is about learning to trust your own hands." She didn't know anyone in Galton's Landing. She had $4 less than she'd arrived with, a room until tomorrow, and no plan beyond that. By the cold measure of the world, she still had nothing. But she had the chisel, and now she had the tools. And somewhere in this town there were people whose names were written in a dead man's notebook, people who had been on the receiving end of a kindness so quiet they might not have known what to call it. People who had perhaps forgotten that anyone remembered them. She went and found Ruth Ann at the diner. It took some explaining. Ruth Ann listened the way people listen when they're also doing 3 other things, and then she set down the coffee pot and listened the way people listen when something has actually reached them. She knew Lionel, of course. Everyone in Galton's Landing had known Lionel. She hadn't known about the lean-to. She hadn't known about the notebook. "He fixed those benches himself?" Ruth Ann said at one point quietly, to no one in particular. "He fixed those benches himself." There was a silence that had some weight to it. Ruth Ann knew people. In a town of that size, Ruth Ann knew everyone, the way certain people in small towns become the connective tissue that holds everything together without anyone deciding that should be their job. She knew which families were mentioned in the notebook. She knew who had stayed and who had struggled and who might want to know that someone had been keeping track all this time. Over the next 3 days, Margaret didn't leave Galton's Landing. She'd meant to. She'd meant to catch a bus Thursday morning and figure out the rest from somewhere else. Instead, she found herself in Ruth Ann's back room, the notebook open on the table between them, going through names. Ruth Ann called people. Some came to the diner. Some came to the Beaumont property, where Margaret had gotten Denise's permission to open the lean-to for the purpose of returning what it contained to the community it had been built for. It didn't happen all at once, and it wasn't dramatic. There was no ceremony. There were a few people who came and stood in the lean-to doorway and looked at the tools and didn't say very much. There was a man named Douglas Lariviere, 71 years old, who had been one of Lionel's Saturday woodworking students back in 1998, and who had forgotten, until he walked into that lean-to, that he'd ever known how to use a marking gauge. He held one for a long time. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. There was a woman named Helena Tran, who came to the diner, and read through the letters from her mother's name, and then excused herself and came back 20 minutes later, with her eyes slightly red, and asked if she could keep one of them. Margaret said she thought that was exactly what they were there for. There was a family, the Marchans, 4 of them, parents, and 2 teenage daughters, who had been living for the better part of a year with a broken kitchen table, eating on folding chairs because they couldn't afford the repair and couldn't bring themselves to throw it out because it had been the grandmother's. Margaret spent an afternoon in their kitchen with 2 of Lionel's chisels and a hand plane and the patience Arthur Kemp had given her, and she fixed it. It took 4 hours. The mother made tea and didn't hover, which was exactly the right thing to do. When Margaret finished and the table was solid again, the older daughter sat down at it and put her hands flat on the surface and didn't say anything, which was also exactly the right thing. Word moves differently in a small town than it does anywhere else. It moves the way heat moves through old walls. Slowly, pervasively, and through pathways you didn't know were there. By the end of the week, Margaret had been asked to look at a chair, a door frame, a window sash that had been painted shut for a decade. She did not say yes to all of them, because she had limits, and Arthur had taught her that knowing your limits was part of the work, but she said yes to enough. Denise, when she came back to finalize the estate, found Margaret in the lean-to with a woman named Sylvie, who was 63, and had driven 40 minutes because her granddaughter wanted to learn how to use a hand plane, and there was apparently no one closer who could teach her. Denise stood in the doorway for a moment. She looked at the tools in their places, the workbench clean, the shelves reorganized slightly but carefully. She said, "Uncle Lionel would have liked this." She didn't say it as a compliment. She said it as a fact. The way you state something when you finally understood it. Margaret stayed in Galton's Landing. Not forever, though sometimes places you stay for a while become forever without announcing it. She got a room from a landlord named Gordon Fetz, who charged her less than he should have, and explained that the house had been empty since August, and he didn't like empty houses. She spent mornings at the Beaumont lean-to, which Denise had agreed to leave undisturbed for the time being. She spent afternoons doing repairs, the kind of small, precise work that a town accumulates when it's been running low on people who know how to do it. She started, slowly, recording her own version of what Lionel had recorded. Who needed what, who had what to offer, the informal arithmetic of a community trying to stay in balance. She didn't think of it as filling his shoes. She didn't think she could. She thought of it the way Arthur Kemp had described teaching. Not passing something on, but passing something through. Lionel had received something from whoever taught him. Arthur had received something from whoever taught him. Now Margaret was receiving it, in the form of a lean-to full of hand tools and a notebook full of names, and a $4 padlock that had opened into 30 years of quiet, faithfully kept care. The chisel, the old Witherby with the maple handle, she kept on the workbench in the lean-to. Not because she didn't use it. She used it more than ever, but because she'd decided it belonged somewhere permanent now. Somewhere it could be found. She thought about this sometimes in the evenings, when the light had gone, and the workshop smelled of cedar shavings and the particular cold that comes in through the gaps in old buildings, and isn't entirely unpleasant. She thought about a 22-year-old woman with a box of belongings and $63, standing at a bus counter asking for somewhere she'd never heard of. She thought about the bus ride through the bare November trees. She thought about $4. It was, she would tell people later, the best $4 she had ever spent. Though we think, if you pressed her, she might say it was the chisel that mattered more. The chisel and the man who gave it to her and the lesson he gave her along with it, that the work is never really about the thing you're making. It's about learning to trust your own hands. And here is what we'd ask you, if you'll let us. Has there ever been a moment in your life when you found something? A place, a person, an old tool, a letter you almost didn't open, that turned out to be exactly what you needed, even though you had no way of knowing it at the time? We'd love to hear about it. Leave it in the comments below. We read everyone.